Greetings. Welcome to the Dr. J Vlog series. It is Thursday, February 27th, 2025, and on Thursdays we tackle knowledge and science. Today's vlog is going to be the first of a series of vlogs dealing with the scientific method and scientific attitude, essentially the foundational aspects of science as a system of knowledge building. I think that's absolutely critical to enhancing our own understanding individually and collectively of what science can and cannot do. And this can then serve as the foundation for more in-depth discussions and I think more credible discussions of scientific matters. Nothing wrong with all the great science channels that are out there, some of which I'm a subscriber to as well. My only concern, or maybe the limitation I would suggest at the outset, might be that we're all typically coming at the channels and at our attempts to understand scientific knowledge from different perspectives. And what I mean by that is based on different levels of experience and expertise with science and understanding of what science is and what science isn't. And there's nothing wrong with any of that, but rather what I'd like to do is just initiate kind of a longer-term discussion about the scientific approach, or what Lee McIntyre describes as the scientific attitude. And that's indeed where I'm going to start. So with the book of that same title. So Lee McIntyre penned this book, The Scientific Attitude. I really want to recommend that you have a read or have a look at the book. I'll put a link in the description as per usual. But Dr. McIntyre has a PhD in philosophy from the University of Michigan, and among other things, he's a research fellow at Boston University's Center for Philosophy and History of Science. And that's what his work has mainly focused on over the many years he's been a scholar and been a research fellow and a few other things. He publishes a fair bit in popular magazines as well around these kinds of issues. So he published, again, The Scientific Attitude, his book in he has a few books, but he published the Scientific Attitude in 2019 with MIT Press. And so I'm going to share some of his insights on the subject, interspersed with my interpretations based on my career in the social sciences and my long-term interest as well in studying the fundamental nature of science as a uniquely successful truth system in the production, or if you look at it in terms of the pantheon of all of the possible truth systems that have existed since human beings first emerged as a distinct species. So now that's a claim, by the way, that cannot just simply be accepted on the face, but rather must be defended. Why should we believe that scientific explanations offer a superior claim to believability? How can we demonstrate that, or prove that, if you will? Well, in an absolute sense, I'm not sure that we can. Rather, it's more about cultivating an understanding of a certain way of knowing about a certain kind of reality, empirical reality, based on our capacity for human understanding, our sense-making method and abilities, and our ability then to develop theories or explanations to account for what we're observing in nature, and outside of nature for that matter. But as I'll explain in a moment, that's a slightly different kettle of fish. And so anyway, let me start there with the first point. And I'm going to just make 4 points today. I'm not going to make this a lengthy vlog because there's so much information I want to cover. I want to break this up into bite-sized chunks, as it were. Okay? So perhaps for the first point, I'm interested in science mainly as a truth system that helps describe and explain the natural world, or the world of nature, in all of its behavioral complexity. I've talked about behavioral complexity previously. I'll certainly come back to that issue as well. But the overarching focus, and the key word here, is the study of nature, that which occurs naturally and that which we can observe through our sensory capacities as human beings. Nothing more, but nothing less. I'm not claiming or defending the idea that science is the only or always the best system to acquire all knowledge, especially if we're talking about or knowledge about the supernatural, for example, or about death, or about God, and so forth. I merely want to suggest that science isn't your best epistemological option if you want to acquire those types of knowledge. The second point I'd like to make is that there are rigorous criteria that ideally must be met to ensure that, from a scientific perspective, there's a reasonably close match, or we sometimes talk about the fit between our theories and the available data. A core argument of scientific reasoning suggests that knowledge generated has to be potentially verifiable through observations or the gathering of evidence through sensory data. But careful observation alone does not a science make. There has to be a logical component or a theoretical system that allows us to connect our understanding of the patterns that we observe in nature. At the same time, we know that there are clear limits to what we can observe or that which we can experience, which means that we can never study every possibility or every future event. So our experiences and our observational strategies are always limited. The best we could do would be to suggest that here's what we know right now with a certain degree of confidence and based on the available evidence. And the third point then kind of follows logically from the second. As McIntyre has written early in his book, at its heart, what is distinctive about science is that it cares about evidence and is willing to change its theories on the basis of evidence, end quote. So to have a scientific attitude, then, one must admit to the possibility of being wrong about one's claims. And that can be quite a challenge for us as human beings, because we generally like to think we're right about things, or at least those things where we feel we have some special insight or information or experience, or at least enough that we feel warranted in making the kinds of truth claims that we're making. Indeed, if I think that I'm telling you the truth about something, whether that's a scientific truth or a spiritual truth, whether that's a logical truth or a moral truth, usually, again, speaking for myself, I like to think that I'm right. And if I stake my reputation and even my funding on my truth claims, well, I'm even more motivated, essentially to try to convince you that I'm right. But even if I'm quite modest in my claims, I still rather be right than wrong. I mean, don't we, as a general principle? If nothing else, I'd like to avoid the embarrassment of being wrong. I don't even like to put the wrong word up or misspell a word when I'm doing a PowerPoint presentation or a class presentation or a lecture. Anyway, and still, we have to acknowledge that that's the best that we can do. In other words, all we can do, and this is not nothing, this is actually quite important, is state our truth claims and explain these as the most likely explanations in light of our current knowledge and methods and available data. And even then, we have to be willing and able to subject our claims to further investigation and potential falsification. We have to always run the risk in science of being wrong. And thus we have to have a certain humility. And then in light of what we know, and crucially, in light of what we don't know. Okay, then the fourth and final related point would be this. We have to avoid lapsing into a cult-like devotion or ideological commitment to scientific truth claims. And what I mean by that, or at least, again, from my perspective, is that we still have to recognize the limits of scientific knowledge, or as at least partly a reflection of the social and cognitive biases of us as scientists, as human beings. We are all human, after all, who engage in science, and thus we can't avoid or eliminate our humanness and, as I'd say from a social scientific perspective, our social locations as part of the scientific process. So then, and I think then that's perhaps where our greatest challenge actually lies. It involves the degree to which we can offer plausible justifications for our approaches and our truth claims. And then the challenge becomes getting others, other independent observers, to agree with our claims, or at least to buy into them to a certain degree. And to do that, in my view, requires that we be as painfully open and honest as we can about our definitions and conceptualizations of what we think we're studying, what we claim to be studying, but also about our open and honest about our observational strategies and the methodologies that we're using to gather data, and open and honest, too, about the actual evidence gathered, to allow others to independently work with and verify, or perhaps at times reject our claims. And so it's on that latter point that we see more often these days published scientists providing links or access to their original data. And that's a good thing, in my view. And thus we are able to deal with the limitations and the humanness and potential ideological threats to our knowledge or a cult-like obsession by becoming as broad and open a community of scholars as possible. So in scientific circles, we are, or at least should be, open to investigators regardless of their gender, racial or ethnic background, nationality, or any other status characteristics. In fact, the most robust and successful sciences always admit to having practitioners from across the globe, many of whom work in tandem with others from completely different social and linguistic backgrounds, for that matter. Now, I don't want to overwhelm anyone with today's discussion of the scientific foundations of human knowledge and the strengths and the limitations and so on. Rather, for today's vlog, my aim is merely to identify the preconditions associated with the development of McIntyre's scientific attitude. There are still plenty of problems and challenges that have to be addressed with science as a truth system, and that'll always be the case. But, as we'll see over the next series of vlogs on the topic, there are, in my view, far more advantages and real advances in human understanding, and indeed improvements to the human condition and quality of life that are directly attributable to the scientific attitude and scientific method. So many of you, of course, might already agree, right? And you don't really need much convincing on, certainly not from me, if anybody else. But I'd still like to encourage those of you who are the true believers to still maintain a healthy skepticism to what we know through science and continue to refine your own understandings of science. And really, I'd like to encourage those of us who are the true believers, that we should continuously display humility, that we need to recognize the limits of our truth claims. don't be shy. Don't silence your voice. Say what you know, and then be able to defend that based on, again, your methods, your theories, your methods, your actual data, and share that with others and so forth. So anyway, we'll get more into that later on. Others of you, of course, might be more on the fence when it comes to the scientific attitude. And for you folks, I hope to help you see in a more comprehensive and robust way what the scientific attitude and approach to the study of nature can and does look like. And I'll emphasize especially the advantages, but I'll not shy away from discussing the limitations and disadvantages as well. But in the end, I'm hopeful that I'll be able to convince most of you, and those of you who are on the fence, that is, that it's a worthwhile endeavor. It's something that we should continue to fund and to believe in, again, with a healthy dose of skepticism, but that it's a worthwhile endeavor on so many levels. And then, of course, there are those of you who are the denialists, for example, and we'll see what happens. But by definition, McIntyre notes on page 158 that denialism is when we refuse to believe something, even in the face of what most others would be or would take to be compelling evidence, because we do not want it to be true, end quote. Or you might not believe that everything in nature, or you might not believe the scientific explanations for how nature operates, because in your view, perhaps God is the ultimate source of knowledge. And some would argue that God is the ultimate explanation and authority for everything that we humans could ever know, whether about nature or outside of nature. And by the way, believe it or not, I'm cool with that. If that's how you feel, that's how you feel. That's based on your background, your culture, your understanding of religion, spirituality, other truth systems, etc. And I don't think that there's anything inherently wrong with any of that. So instead, what I'd like to suggest for those of you who fall into this third camp, and that is, or anybody who's kind of motivated by non-scientific approaches, or just if you personally refuse to believe things because you don't want them to be true, I still think that the vlog series on knowledge and science will be helpful. I'd like to entertain the possibility of perhaps creating at least a few cognitive openings where you have the eternal doubters and the absolutist with respect to God, and that you might be willing through these cognitive openings to at least see the value of a scientific attitude in our daily or worldly affairs. Maybe not, but that's my aim. Okay, I'm going to end there today. We're going to pick up on this over the next several weeks, so I hope you're excited and energized and willing to go along with me on this particular journey, this deep dive into knowledge and science that will unfold, as I say, over a period of several weeks. So until I next see you, whether that be tomorrow or next week on the vlog series, may you and yours continue to create peace in your lives and nurture love in your hearts, and give someone who needs a hug today, if you have the opportunity. All right, hope to see you soon.